Welcome to hell. Nail-Angling, anxious to try every sort of new experiment, wanted to introduce a tragic dance at this point for the two Marys around the prostrate figure of Christ's mother. This, in view of their Catholic upbringing in Ireland, was too much for the Dubliners. They refused to countenance it. Atling, however, and this had happened in other cases as well, insisted on going on with it, with the result that the two girls who were playing the two Marys, Bessie and Lizzie Marsh, from Bev Town, were completely confused, and as they bent together over the prostrate form of the Virgin, they made several sinuous movements with their flexible hips and several swaying movements with their bare arms, while at the same time they lifted up their voices and chanted the ballad-like refrain that Atling had written for them. The nervous blundering of these young and pretty girls was not at all distasteful to the bulk of the foreigners, to some of whom it appeared as the final touch of modern art, to others as a naive example of English barbarism. But to the feelings of Mary Crowe, who recognized at once that someone had made a mistake, it was a harrowing spectacle. She turned hurriedly to catch the eye of Father Paleologue, but he smiled back at her reassuringly, however, and when she murmured her fears, "Oh, of course one can see that," he whispered. But chances has favored these people at every turn, and though to many these dances gestures, they are doing it again, must seem ridiculous enough and even outrageous, still you must remember that the Magdalene must in her time have danced for her patrons. Why should she not now, poor girl, like the juggler of Paris before the altar, dance for the crucified? "But father," she protested, "the other Mary, the type of contemplation, surely—" Yes, lady," he conceded. "It's a mistake. It's the only bad mistake they've made. But those little girls are sworn creatures, and sweet creatures, and— Father, I believe you are laughing at us at this time." Father Paleologue became in a moment intensely grave. "If I did that, dear daughter," he said earnestly, "I'll deserve to be unfrocked. I deserve to be cut in pieces like your last abbot. I deserve anyhow." And he gave her an irresistibly winning smile that broke through the mask of his stiff, archaic face, as though a lamp had been lit within his soul. "Not to have had the exquisite pleasure I've already had today." "Thank God they're going, those girls," cried Mrs. Drew in a shrill voice. "And they're dancing away, hand in hand now, as if it were a maypole they were leaving, not their dying savior." Her words reached the ears of the Marquis of P., who turned and gave her a gracious little bow. It was the first time he had recognized Miss Drew today, but these caustic sometimes of hers met with his entire approval. These caustic sentiments of hers. Excuse me, in hell we get confused. "Are those baggages," remarked Miss Barbara Fell, "who have just come dancing off into the tents, supposed to be camp followers, soldiers gambling there?" Fell returned no answer. "I asked you, Manny, if those girls—" and she repeated her whole remark. "One of them is a saint, still invoked in Glastonbury, sister." The doctor's voice was strained on to the breaking point, and in his heart he was saying to himself, "I can't bear it. I can't bear it. I can't bear it." And the others is that Mary, the sister of Lazarus, who was much of a special friend of Jesus. I don't know why they swayed about like that. Perhaps they were so unhappy that they took to drink. "What's the matter, Angela?" asked Mr. Beer crossly. "You can't sit still a moment. We can't go before the end. I suppose it's getting on for the end now." These extraordinary words, that could scarcely have been uttered on this continent of Europe, were huskily heard by no one except Angela, and to her they were no more than the portentous yawn from the old gentleman that followed them. They were no more than the buzzing of a blue-bottle fly that at that moment flew past her ears. Her face was white and her whole body was trembling with excitement. The soul within her yearned to that beautiful form that now with uplifted arms was embracing the feet of the suspected figure. These were another person in that big audience who was as agitated as Angela Beer, and that was the Vicar of Glastonbury. Indignation had colored Matt Decker's face a dusky red, and his heavy brown brows were knotted over his bushy eyebrows. The whole business filled him with sick aversion. Why, oh why, had he ever allowed such a thing as this to make a place of his loved town, to take place in his loved town? For all his high church practice, Matt Decker at heart was as an example of evangelical as John Bunyan or John Wesley. He regarded this whole performance as a monstrous and ghastly parody of all historic events that had changed the life of the cosmos. I can't stick it out, son, I can't stick it out, he groaned. Sam laid his large hand on his father's knee. It's the end now, Dad, I think. Those fellows lugging the stepladder are going to take him down. Ned Athling is with him himself. He's supposed to be Joseph of Arimathea. Damn Ned Athling. It was at this moment that the crazed Evans uttered the only words he had spoken since he had been lifted up. He cried suddenly in a great voice that rang out across Tor Fields and across the gypsy caravans and across Chiltwick Street, till it reached the blood-red fountain in Chalice Hill. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. The two Deckers rose simultaneously to their feet. That man, that Evans, wasn't playing then. Look, my boy, his heart's really hanging down now. I must see to this. Go slow, Dad, he may be all right. It may only be his damned acting. Don't make a fool of yourself, Dad. No, it's no joke. They're running out of the tents. They're breaking up. Something is wrong. He is ill. He's hurt. He's fainted. They pushed their way together between the rows of seats and began running towards the stage. They were not the first to do this, however. A good distance in front of them, Cordelia Gurd was rushing wildly towards that great cross of oak wood. Their movements were a signal of general uprising. Many others, among them Dr. Fell, were running now up their slope towards the terrace where Mr. Evans hung by his armpits. Meanwhile, it was the ironical duty of the pretended St. Joseph to act in real, genuine earnest in this unrehearsed descent from the cross. Inside the Western Pavilion there was now a scene of the utmost confusion. The two Marys, little Bessie and Lizzie, had been both sobbing hysterically in shame over their fiasco. John Crow had been vainly trying to comfort them. Us have spoiled the pageant, Bessie was moaning. Oh, why did they let me do it? Us'll never be able to look anyone in the face again, Lizzie was wailing. I wish I were dead. I wish I were dead. But the little maid's distress was now broken into by a wild uproar. Evans had fainted. Evans has burst a blood vessel. There be bloody pouring out of Evans's mouth. Both John and Barter, careless now about appearing before the audience in their ordinary clothes, rushed out of the tent and ran to the scene of the trouble. The Roman soldiers had already left their dice and their cards and were engaged in helping the Jewish elders lift the cross bodily out of the ground and lower it down upon the grass. There were so many powerful young farmhands among them that this was not a difficult undertaking. Cowper had come up meanwhile and was gesticulating violently, talking so rapidly in French that everyone near him only stared. Some of the Roman soldiers, rough lads from the Sedgemoor farms, nudged each other and made fun of him. Play over, play quite done, they cried to him in pidgin English as if it were a Chinaman. Cordelia had become cold and calm. She was giving rapid, indecisive directions to the lads who were lowering the cross. Ned Athling, in a bewildered trance, perched upon the upper steps of his stepladder, was contemplating the surging movements which looked like a dangerous panic that were now rocking the excited audience. He tried to make out the figure of Lady Rachel, but the crowd was too dense. Barter was one of the few who kept his head at this juncture. Did you say that those Dublin people had got a megaphone somewhere? He asked. John looked at him quickly. To quite in the audience, you mean? Of course, we can't let them break up without a word. Let's go and see. They crossed over to the eastern tent, and there, sure enough, after word with the Dubliners, whom they found on their knees, hurriedly flinging all their private belongings into the two black handbags, like passengers in a sinking ship, the megaphone was produced. What shall we say? Will you do it? Barter found himself yelling those words into John's ears as they carried their megaphone past the outskirts of the crowd that was now surging and shouting about the prostrate cross and above the unconscious form of Mr. Evans. It must have been that vision of the Dubliners packing their black bags that compelled him to yell like that when John could perfectly well have heard a whisper. And what unconscious force was it that made the two friends like two field marshals whose army is defeated and in full flight carry the megaphone back to their own eastern tent instead of using it at once where they had found it? The power of habit with these two men had been more quickly established than one would have believed possible. John and Barter must have hurried with their megaphone to the spot where they were used to giving their orders, as instinctively as a dog carries a bone to his kennel. Probably in a boat of starving derelicts who have just killed and torn to pieces one of their companions, each man would be driven to convey his portion of the cannibal feast to his own bench by the side of his own robe lock. At the door of their own tent, they encountered Crummy, freshly emerged from the ladies' tiring room, and as trim and lovely as ever in an ordinary summer frock. Oh, it's beginning to clear up here in hell. Quite nice. The sun's back out. Oh, I'm so glad you've got this thing, she cried. I was just going to ask you if there wasn't something of that sort to quiet them. I suppose if we'd only fainted, you'd go on with the pageant. John looked at Barter, and Barter looked at John. What a girl this was. They, began Barter. We thought we'd let it end here, said John. Crummy surveyed the two disconcerted representatives of her father with a puzzled frown. She then turned her eyes upon the audience. Yes, they were all on their feet, and most of them pushing and struggling to extricate themselves from the chairs and benches. Soon they would be scattered in all directions. Many were already rushing wildly up the hill towards the pavilion. The girl smiled sweetly. Better do it now if you're going to do it, she said. Tell them that the mayor bids them goodbye and thanks them for coming. John lifted the megaphone to his mouth. Do I just shout it out? He asked her nervously. Mr. Gaird's daughter looked around. The Middlezoy foreman, still dressed up as King Arthur, was standing nearby, quietly lighting his pipe. She called the man by name, and he slouched up to them. Take this, said Crummy. Run over to Pilot's what-you-call-it, will you? Shout out to them that the mayor bids them goodbye and tell them to go home quietly and that Mr. Evans has only fainted. King Arthur lost no time in obeying to the letter this clear command to the resuscitated Lady of Shalott. He extended the wooden rostrum, and standing erect there, a majestic and imposing figure, he bellowed forth in a terrific voice, Ladies and gentlemen, attention all, please. His words were audible all over the field. Even the gypsies in their caravans heard them. The dye-works strikers came pouring out of Dickie's cantle tent, well refreshed with meat and wine. Everybody stood still and listened. It was as if the real Rexaturus himself had suddenly reappeared to restore peace upon earth and fulfill his magician's prophecy. What a girl, whispered Barter to John as they followed Crummy with their eyes as she stood behind the rostrum, prompting the Middlezoy foreman. But Evans may be dead, murmured John. Not he, returned the other, but even if he is. The mayor wishes to assure ye all that the gentleman be only fainted. The mayor thinks best for pageant to end here and now. The mayor thanks ye all for coming, especially those of ye what came from far. The mayor hopes ye'll all come to Glastonbury again. The mayor... There was a pause at this point, while King Arthur bent his head to catch the prompter's words. Then raising the megaphone again, the mayor gives ye all the blessing of the living Christ. The foreman came carefully down the creaking wooden steps with the megaphone under his arm. Crummy was watching with delight the surprising effect of these words from the slope of the hill. It was as if, in the very midst of some wild panic, under the urge of an earthquake or a volcano, every person had been struck mute and immobile, exactly where they were. Even John and Barter were silent for a moment, staring down at that petrified mass of people. John had time to observe that when the crowd began to move again, it was in quite a different manner. There was no longer a tendency to rush up the hill in a dense mob. Everyone seemed to become a separate individual again. The crowd hypnosis had been entirely dispelled by this invocation of the Redeemer of the individual. Amen. Well, that's the end of our passage in Glastonbury Romance for today. And look, the sky is cleared up. The storm is over. We've survived hell once again. Keep that in mind. The storm always passes. Till next